Thank you. Thanks so much. It's really wonderful to say thank you for the warm California welcome. Being from Wisconsin, you can appreciate what I mean. One thing real briefly too, just as we get started, if you have a cell phone, just please turn it off for the next hour or so. That'd be great, just as a courtesy to everybody else here. So, you all seen one of these? Probably not for a while now that we're all digital, but you know, there's a little bit of sand flowing through it, and what is this doing? Passing time. It's measuring time. And in 2 minutes and 43 seconds, the eggs will be ready. Well, what happens, in fact, we'll just kind of put it up front and center here. What happens when the sand runs to the bottom? Have I run out of time? No, I've just run out of sand. You know, trying to measure, let alone understand time, is something that's occupied us, well, for quite some time. Here in the U.S., we've had movies, maybe they've even played here at the Rio, movies like Back to the Future, Kate and Leopold. They have time travel themes in them. And in H.G. Wells' classic novel, The Time Machine, the time traveler says before he begins his tale, he says to his friends, I shall have to controvert one or two ideas that are almost universally accepted. Well, what does controvert mean? It means to overturn. It means to reverse something that's viewed as kind of common knowledge, taken for granted. But we find that whenever we overturn, whenever we controvert universal assumptions like those that are attached to the concept of time and the concept of stress that often goes with it, we're bound to discover new ideas. Ideas to respond to things like these. As Americans today, we are putting in longer hours on the job now than we did in the 1950s. In fact, we are working longer hours with less vacation than the citizens of any other industrialized nation in the 21st century. Also, as a nation, the United States apparently has one of the highest rates of so-called midlife crisis, or the midlife blues of any industrialized nation in the world. And one other point that I was interested to learn not long ago, the Gallup organization has reported that half of all Americans say they don't have enough time to get everything done. And a third say that they're stressed out a lot of the time. You know, when I was back in school, in high school, I was taking pictures for the high school yearbook, and track meets and swim meets were timed with analog stopwatches. You know, the kind with the moving hands that you see on 60 Minutes. Tick, 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 tick. Now we have digital electronic systems that clock runners and swimmers to 1/1000th of a second. Imagine winning or losing a race by a fragment of time that you can't even describe verbally because it takes too long. So yes, we do need to controvert some of these universal assumptions. We need to push back at how the world measures time and how this leads to all sorts of limits, labels, and obstacles in our lives. And we push back by looking at life through a completely different lens, through a spiritual one. Where do we start? I sometimes like to ask audiences, how can we exchange deadlines for lifelines? Well, you know what? I think we may have to controvert one or two ideas that are almost universally accepted. So let's start then. Let's look back. Let's look back to about 100 or so years ago to how a 26-year-old Swiss patent clerk completely overturned the world's view about the relationship between light, mass, and energy to time. Albert Einstein's special theory of relativity, and you know the equation E equals mc squared. That completely rewrote the universally accepted ideas about the velocity of the speed of light. He concluded that the speed of light is a constant, that it could never vary, and it could never be exceeded. And that discovery reshaped everything humanity knew about the universe. It reshaped it to conform to the constant of light speed. But here's the thing that really challenged thought. Einstein's theory found that as a traveling body, a moving object, approaches the speed of light, time slows down. That was a monumental shift in how science and society looked at the world. Well, there's a modern day physicist who's also been thinking about this. His name is Brian Greene. And several years ago, he wrote this: "The relativity of space and time is a startling conclusion. From the premise that the speed of light is constant, we conclude that space and time are in the eye of the beholder." Now we're getting to it. Space and time are in the eye of the beholder. Would you like to prove that? Okay, I'm glad you do. Think about something you really dislike doing, someplace you'd really rather not be. Doing your taxes, being in the traffic out here tonight, whatever it may be. How does time pass in that scenario where you just really don't want to be? Really slowly, right? Now, think of your favorite activity, maybe a favorite sport, a concert, having dinner with friends. How does that time seem to pass? Really quickly. You look at the watch, and the next time you look, it's 45 minutes later. And yet, this little sand in this timer or the digital stopwatches today, that sand still falls at the rate of 60 seconds to the minute, 60 minutes to the hour, assuming we're not traveling at the speed of light. So what is it then that makes time seem to pass so slowly in the one scenario and so quickly in the other? What is it? It's our thinking. It's our conscious mental view of where we are and what we're doing. As Brian Greene said, it's in the eye of the beholder. So from this then, might we say that the passage of time really has far less to do with the hands on the watch or the sand in the egg timer. It has much less to do with the actual physical measurement of time. And might we then say instead that it has everything to do with our mental perspective? Einstein's discoveries in 1905 pushed humanity's view of physics outward in many, many new directions. But now let's take those and let's hold them up to the spiritually transforming discoveries made 30 years earlier by an American woman. Now, like Einstein, this woman was a visionary. She was a pioneer in the realm of thought. But her ideas on metaphysics, on divinity, on the spiritual nature of man and the universe, they not only preceded Einstein's discovery by 3 decades, her ideas continue today to overturn all sorts of commonplace assumptions and views about the nature of time, space, matter, and the universe right here in the 21st century. She wrote, "Man is the idea of spirit. He reflects the beatific presence, illuming the universe with light. Man is deathless, spiritual. He is above sin or frailty. He does not cross the barriers of time into the vast forever of life, but he coexists with God and the universe. Well, the woman that I'm speaking of is Mary Baker Eddy. She's the woman who discovered Christian Science, tested and proved its principles in the laboratory of real life, and wrote the world's most distinctive and definitive text on practical spiritual thinking and healing that the world has ever known. And the book that I just read from is Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures. And in fact, I should mention that our hosts for tonight's talk have a table set up in the outer lobby with copies of Science and Health for you to take home with you. They're complimentary. Love to have you. In fact, don't just take one, take two. One for yourself and one to share with a friend who maybe is struggling with these same concepts of not enough time and too much stress. Well, this book, Science and Health, together with the Holy Bible, they're going to be our guide this evening as we consider these ideas on crossing the barriers of time, among others. But here's our navigation for tonight. This is not going to be a discussion about working smarter, not harder. It's not about that at all. Rather, what we're going to be doing is thinking together about some elevated ideas about time, space, and matter that is going beyond their physical limitations into the spiritual nature of eternity, the spiritual nature of the source of divine intelligence and order in the universe. And we're going to be considering spirit. Spirit as a name for God, but spirit also as the only true substance and reality of the universe. And I think a great place for us to start then is with this spiritually advanced definition of time that Mary Baker Eddy gives in Science and Health. She defines time this way: mortal measurements, limits, in which are summed up all human acts, thoughts, beliefs, opinions, knowledge. Matter, error, that which begins before and continues after what is termed death, until the mortal disappears and spiritual perfection appears. So then if we say, well, gosh, I really need more time to get the kids to soccer practice. I need more time to finish that proposal for the new client. I need more time with the family after work, more time to clean the house, more time to do the remodeling project, etc., etc. Think about what you're asking for. Are you really asking for more mortal measurements and limits? Because if that's what you want, then go ahead, ask for more time. But let's look again at the end of that definition. It says, until the mortal disappears and spiritual perfection appears. Would you think along with me and perhaps at least for the moment agree that that could include the strictly mortal view of time until the mortal disappears and the spiritual perfection appears? You know, Einstein's theories were a journey into light. And he reasoned that time must conform to the velocity of light. Well, what could we expect from the viewpoint of spiritual light, from a better, higher, more spiritually informed perspective, from a perspective that takes the intelligent evidence of thought, if we take that over the evidence of what appears to our limited physical senses, to sight, hearing, egg timer, etc. This is what Christian Science really is about. It's about a revolution in perspective. Now, put it in media language today. You might call it extreme makeover, thought edition. A change in perspective changes our perception. Walking around town, you see a flat earth with people, cars, buildings, etc. But as I often do, travel at 35,000 feet, Earth looks quite different from up there. You see crop circles. You see these little lines crisscrossing the desert, which you realize are roads. Go up into space, and you see Earth as a sphere with its continents and oceans, and placed in the context of where it belongs in the galaxy among the moon and the stars, the other planets. So an elevated, improved perspective really starts to help us drop mortal and physical limits and measurements. In another statement in Science and Health, Mrs. Eddy wrote this. It's a remarkable singular sentence. She says, "The spiritual reality is the scientific fact in all things." There's no disclaimer on that page. All things except those which pertain to me. The spiritual reality is the scientific fact in all things. Now, for her to be able to write about the scientific fact of spiritual reality, this was a revolutionary statement, considering that during her adult lifetime, which was the Victorian era, science really wasn't heading in that direction at all. And as I think about these statements of hers concerning time, space, matter, etc., I so admire her scientific accuracy as well as her uncompromising courage in stating the truth. Mary Baker Eddy was reading the spiritual signs of her time, and where Einstein, in fact, was pushing back the limits of physical science, she was perceiving, in fact, she was actually causing a rapidly unfolding metaphysical revolution in science. Together, as you and I understand spiritual reality as the scientific fact in all things, this is the foundation of Christian Science and its system of healing through prayer. And if you think about it as applied science, put a capital S on it, you'll start to see how it brings freedom from the limited physical concepts of time and space, right down to eliminating the stress that society attaches to things like aging, the employment that we have or maybe don't have, the economy, the rapidity with which our children and grandchildren grow up, etc. Now, a little bit earlier at the top of the talk, I mentioned this prevalent issue here in the United States about people going through a so-called midlife crisis, or having the midlife blues. Do you know that term, midlife? That implies that life itself is on some sort of linear timeline. But Christian Science shows that life isn't linear. It's not a brief, time-dependent journey that starts at birth and then grows, turns into a teenager, matures, decays, and then ends. That's not life. Life, indeed, and in fact, is part of the eternal continuity of good that forms the basis of God's creation. And let me just say that again. Life is part of the eternal continuity of good that forms the basis of God's creation. In the Bible, in the book of Job, this is from the Amplified Bible, it says here that you and I can lift up our face without stain, and that our life shall be clearer than the noonday and rise above it. Though there be darkness, it shall be as the morning. What does this imply for you and me? Well, let me share with you what it implied and ultimately what it meant in deeply spiritual terms to my friend, Paul. About a dozen years ago, Paul had a serious career setback, something that others could easily have defined as a midlife crisis. He was a senior bank manager, and because of a merger of his bank with another much larger one, he was forced into resigning his position as a senior bank manager doing a specific kind of work. But as he began his search for a new position, he discovered some things. He discovered an employment market that wasn't exactly welcoming him with open arms. You see, he was over 50 years old. He had highly specialized skills and experience, and banks were looking for younger staff with a broader range of expertise than he had. Well, my friend knew that he had some things to controvert here, that there were in fact several paths that he could choose. One, he could have followed conventional business tactics, start by networking with past clients and colleagues, get his resume out in the workplace, have lunch with people that he knew, call recruiters, watch the papers. Another option, hang tough, be a survivor. Maybe live on his savings for a while. Maybe borrow a little money to pay the bills once in a while. Meanwhile, to just really hang on and hope for the best. And you know, if you've ever been unemployed involuntarily, and I have, maybe some of you have as well, maybe personal pride in a situation like that would argue, well, it's their loss, not mine. Third option open to my friend was prayer. And that's the path he ultimately did choose. Because prayer helped him to begin to rediscover the ever-presence of God as Spirit in his life, beholding and upholding him, his career, and his family in their original state of clarity, vitality, and purpose. And that this clarity, vitality, and purpose were not fading out with the passage of time. He had not reached some magic age threshold where he was far less attractive as an employee. And also, as my friend prayed, he began to see that his financial security, his assets, weren't in a job. They really didn't come from an employer or a paycheck. Now, yes, it's true, he was out of a job, but he wasn't out of assets. Spiritual assets, the opportunity, the things that he had inherently, like honesty, the ability to think and act intelligently, to be wise, to be creative, flexible, adaptable. My friend Paul also realized that his purpose and his worth, and in turn the security of his home and his family, they were never defined by other people or midlife circumstances. His true and lasting worth lay within these eternal, spiritual, timeless qualities that God, as divine mind, as spirit, and as love, had already given him. And these qualities were something that the world needed. Now, my friend also thought deeply about the life example of Mary Baker Eddy as a thinker and as a healer, and especially her role as the discoverer and founder of Christian Science. Her experience spoke to him with strength and authority. For example, one thing she had learned from her own experience was that we find our true purpose, our true calling, in spirit, in infinite love. Paul also began to see how the qualities of inner stillness and spiritual resolve strengthen someone's confidence and poise. It gave him a whole new perspective on his own situation, and he gained such a deep appreciation of how Mrs. Eddy never allowed turmoil, uncertainty, opposition, or the tyranny of time and stress to interfere with her spiritually good purpose. In fact, one national newspaper commented in 1910, reflecting on her life and now her passing from this earth, commented that it was Mrs. Eddy's mission to do nothing but good. So, how did all this relate to my friend Paul? Well, glad you asked. Because this was actually how he needed to identify himself and his own mission at this stage of his experience, as someone committed only to good, not as an unemployed, unwanted, middle-aged mortal. Well, that discovery in prayer eventually led my friend to a unique and rather unconventional decision. Would you like to consider what that may have been? What do you think he maybe was led to do? Someone said to become a Christian Science practitioner, to go into the healing practice. Not at this point, not full-time anyway. Senior bankers lost his job. I'm sorry? Started his own bank. That's exactly what he did. That is precisely what he did. And he started it with the singular goal of helping others not just progress, but to truly prosper. And this motivation to see his business as a way to give rather than to get has helped him to permanently exchange some very narrow views about himself and his work for the deeper, lasting, spiritual views of what principled and loving business leadership can really accomplish. He told me a while ago, he said, I've really come to see through this that employment isn't so much about the work we do as it is about working out our salvation, and that this is something we keep growing with. There is no fading out of finding and developing and working out our own salvation. Now again, Science and Health offers another definition that's incredibly relevant here, because many days went by, in fact about 365, as my friend Paul worked through this whole situation. So again, from the same chapter, the glossary in Science and Health, we have the definition of day. The irradiance of life, light, the spiritual idea of truth and love. The objects of time and sense disappear in the illumination of spiritual understanding, and mind, with a capital M, again referring to God, mind measures time according to the good that is unfolded. Now there's an important connection between this definition of day and the definition of time that we looked at a little while ago. Did you maybe catch what that was? One specific thought. Let me refresh you. Definition of time. That which begins before, continues after what is termed death, until the mortal disappears and spiritual perfection appears. Definition of day, the objects of time and sense disappear in the illumination of spiritual understanding. So both of these definitions are talking about the disappearance of matter. Now, there's an area of technology today where the objects keep getting smaller and smaller, but their capacity keeps getting bigger and bigger. You know what that is. Computers. And all of the technology that's literally at our fingertips or in the palms of our hands that make use of this computerized technology. Our knowledge of computing has progressed to the point where a microscopic pinch of silicon and gold can now do the calculations in color and sound and motion that would have taken several tons of metal and vacuum tubes literally filling entire rooms, probably no more than 30 years ago. Would you accept then that this is an example of the objects of time and sense disappearing in the illumination of understanding? They're sure getting smaller. So, if we agree then that these objects are getting smaller to the point of disappearance, then can we ask, if these objects of physical sense and time are shrinking dramatically, what's going to take their place? Because just as nature abhors a vacuum, divine mind permits no vacuums. What's going to take the place of these objects of time and sense? Nothing less than the substance of eternity. Now, to be clear, eternity isn't an endlessly long time. In fact, in its pure, native, spiritual meaning, eternity really is the absence of time. It is timelessness. Eternity is when? Right now. Right now, this moment. And this concept of eternity, which you can perceive spiritually, touches your life in so many important ways. The Bible tells us to love God, your God, listen obediently to Him, firmly embrace Him. Oh yes, He is life itself. And this life, this truth, yet another term for God that we find in the Bible, life, truth, love, spirit, all are eternal. They're timeless, unlimited. And so, the truth about God and about your relationship to Him is just as certain and unlimited today as it ever was and ever will be. Your relationship to God has not changed. It has not diminished. It has not gotten compressed by the demands and pressures of the economy, other people, family, time, or any outside limiting influence. There's a national group out there whose website has coined a term called time stress. Their theory is that overwork, overscheduling, and the light speed pace of modern life hasn't slowed time down. In fact, what it's doing, they claim, is threatening our health, our families, our relationships, our communities, even our environment. But let's ask ourselves this question. Will a limited, stressed out view of time and of our own abilities, will that kind of a view enable us to master this whole time, deadline, pressure thing? Not likely. So what will? What will is your own God-given ability to move at something infinitely faster and more earth-shattering than the speed of light, the speed of thought. You don't need to travel at light speed for time to slow down or stand still. You can think. You can pray. And as you do, you'll discover something amazing. Thought is immediate. It can transport you, change you, move you without delay, without hesitation, without frustration. A young friend of mine proved this for herself in her final year of college. In fact, it was out here in California. Just before Christmas break, she called me. She was in great pain. She could barely speak, and she said her throat was so sore that she couldn't swallow, not even water. And guess when this was? Final exam week. She really needed to feel the grace and love of Christ immediately. And she asked me to pray for her. Why prayer? Why didn't she just go to the campus clinic? Well, because prayer is the key to rediscovering our permanent closeness to God. Prayer helps all of us realize that God's timeless, loving care is ever present. And importantly, prayer helps us to realize there's no waiting period when we ask God for help. Prayer was natural to this young lady. And so together, as she and I talked, I realized that she had been hit really hard by the pressure of time and deadlines and exams and the whole thought of the upcoming Christmas holiday. The pressure and the worry and the effort that she was expending were literally strangling her freedom and joy. They were making her feel totally overwhelmed and stressed out. Well, our prayers together helped her to see that she was, right then and right there, the immortal, unique, valuable expression of the one infinite mind, her Creator. And that she wasn't stifled. She wasn't limited. She wasn't measured according to time, space, matter, or the pile of blue books for writing the exams. That wasn't the true measurement of who she was. Prayer helped us to see, and helped her especially, to realize that she was always loved and supported as the child of God, as the child of life and light. And that was her turning point. Seeing herself as a child of light in this new light, if you will, she was completely released from the hold that fear, stress, and pressure had put on her, and that was trying to strangle her. Well, she got out of bed. She finished studying for all of her exams, took them all over the next couple of days, and just before she left to go home for the holiday, she called and said in her sweet and normal voice, all of the pain had left. And she said, I'm really looking forward to enjoying the holidays with my family and some special meals and things that were coming up. There was no prolonged recovery time, no downtime in the campus clinic, no after effects. She was healed immediately. Now there's an interesting footnote, or maybe a part 2 to this healing. At the end of this very same academic year, my friend didn't receive a final grade in one of her classes. So she contacted the professor and asked what was happening. Why hadn't she posted the grade online? Well, the professor said she hadn't posted her grade because she had found a lot of plagiarized material in the student's final term paper. And the real bombshell? The professor had already reported these findings to the Academic Conduct Committee for judicial review and possible discipline. Now, those of you who are teachers realize that this is serious. She could not only be kicked out of school, but she could be blacklisted. All kinds of things could prevent her from continuing her education. Now, the professor told her, it was kind of along these lines. She said, although I'm sure that you're going to be hurt and angry by this, she said, please realize this is not a personal attack, because I still consider you a strong and responsible student. Now, since this professor happened to be the department chair, she offered my young friend an unusual opportunity, and that was to rewrite the paper over the summer and resubmit it to her before the fall term began, to show that my friend did understand how to avoid plagiarism or even the appearance of it. Well, my student friend, indeed, she was hurt and she was angry at first. Not with the professor. She was angry with herself because when she got the paper back and started looking it over, she realized that although she had done good research and had developed good ideas, she recalled that she had written the paper mostly very late at night, or if you prefer, early in the morning, usually between the hours of about 1 and 4 a.m. She had crammed the writing into just a few days' time. There were incorrect and missing citations of sources, poor grammar, awkward transitions that made it, in fact, look like plagiarism. But all of this really happened because, once again, my friend had bought into this picture of stress, deadline pressure, and limited time. So, when she asked me to pray with her this time, the very first thing we did was to get a crystal clear view that in spite of everything that had gone wrong on this paper, she had never stopped expressing the energy and the integrity of God, of divine mind. Writing a messed up paper did not define her as a cheater or as an inferior student or as a bad person. My friend also had to realize right up front that stressing out about time and the new deadline was not going to be helpful to rewrite the paper. What would be helpful, however, would be to connect with the infinite, timeless, eternal resources of intelligence and the spiritual clarity that God, divine mind, was providing her. And a really important and healing thought came to us, and we found this together in Science and Health one afternoon. Mary Baker Eddy writes, eternity, not time, expresses the thought of life, and time is no part of eternity. One ceases in proportion as the other is recognized. Time is finite. Eternity is forever infinite. Well, what did my friend do? She put the ideas of that statement to work for herself. She realized that as she let the immediate and present power of infinite mind guide her, she would mentally rise above this whole argument of time, stress, limited resources, and pressure. Limited resources because the campus library was closed for the summer. So she had to do all new research, do it online, do it with some things in the public library. Well, summer came and went, and when her professor received the new rewrite, slightly ahead of schedule, I might add, her professor said that although she recognized the high degree of difficulty involved in reworking the entire paper, she was impressed by my friend's honest and principled approach, not only in meeting the deadline, but in showing that she knew what it took to avoid this appearance of plagiarism. So what was the outcome? Well, the professor dropped the disciplinary action. She canceled the judicial review. She gave my friend a B for that course, and that B allowed her to stay on the dean's list and to graduate with honors. You know, the Bible has some wonderful illustrations of the immediacy of Christ's healing power. Lots of different places. In the Gospel of John, for example, chapter 6, we read how one evening Jesus' disciples to go ahead of him on to the next town where he'd be teaching and healing. They set off together in a boat, but after dark a heavy storm comes up, lots of wind, lots of waves, and suddenly they see someone walking on the water to come to them. Well, at first they're afraid because they don't recognize that it's Jesus. But when they finally do recognize that it's him, as the gospel describes in the Amplified Bible, they were very glad for him to come into the boat. And immediately they reached the shore toward which they had been slowly making their way. You know, the Bible tells us that they were rowing about 20 or 30 furlongs. That's only about 2 or 3 miles. They had been rowing all night. The moment Jesus came to the boat, they were at their destination. There's another time when Jesus was confronted by an angry mob. They wanted to push him off a cliff. But as Luke's gospel tells it, he, passing through the midst of them, went his way. Jesus overcame the limitations of matter, of time and space so completely that he simply withdrew from that whole scene without any harm whatsoever. You know, there's actually about 20 times in the Christian scriptures where Jesus and his disciples bring about an immediate healing. No passage of time. One of my favorites is in Mark's Gospel, chapter 5, where Mark tells of a woman who has had a chronic hemorrhaging condition for 12 years. Mark says she had suffered many things of many physicians. She'd spent all that she had. She was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse. But she hears that Jesus is coming to visit the town where she lives. And she goes to meet him. And the intuition comes to her that if she can just get close enough to him to just touch the border of his garment, the hem of his robe, she'll be healed. She makes her way through the crowd, touches his robe, and indeed, immediately she is healed. Now there's one other element to consider here. She didn't just touch his garment. She also felt the divinely loving and healing touch of the Christ itself. And you know, every time you and I feel truly refreshed, truly energized or confident, it's really that same divine love appearing in our consciousness through the Christ. This divine idea or expression of God, this tangible message from God that speaks to our hearts and our minds directly. Christ indeed is the timeless message of God's ever-present love that tells us we are never victims of the storms of sickness or depression or addiction or abuse or whatever the current challenge is. And today, and indeed every day, this Christ, this divine evidence of God, reappears in your conscious thought. This Christ isn't a one-time appearance that happened long ago, but Christ truly is a tangible healing influence that's always present. And the Christ does what? It frees each of us from the frustration and the burnout that so many people just accept as the status quo. Universal assumption. However, and this is a wonderful however, in place of fatigue, stress, burnout, time, poverty, in place of all that, the Christ presence energizes and empowers you by connecting you with God. And that's not a wireless connection, that's hardwired. You are connected to God, who is the very source of your spiritual identity, your strength, your ability. Now, to be clear, I'm drawing an important distinction here between Jesus and the Christ. Jesus appeared in a human form, something and someone the world could understand and perceive and relate to. But in that human form and presence, He wasn't personally eternal, even though his ministry and his example endure today and will endure forever. It's really the divinity of the Christ that was shown so fully in Jesus' healing ministry. That is what is eternal. In other words, Christ is just as present now as when Jesus was here on earth. And the Christ Spirit within Jesus is what made him the way-shower, the one who was appointed to speak God's word to the entire world. And Christ truly expresses God's spiritual, eternal nature, a nature that's infinite, timeless, and permanent. And through the Christ, Jesus showed the world an enduring reality, the sinless, healthy, spiritual, and indeed perfect nature of man, of you and me, as God's children. And this, my friends, is the message of Christ to each one of us, that the substance of our life, and in fact of all reality, is timeless. The message of Christ to us is that the substance of our life, the substance of all reality, is timeless. And that you and I and everyone, as God's expression of himself, we have nothing to do with time, space, or matter. We have everything to do with eternity, divine intelligence, and the infinite joy, dominion, and strength of Spirit. So, here we are. Eggs are still cooking. Remember our discussion at the beginning of the hour about what this does and how time seems to be a mortal, restrictive measurement. But yet everything that we've considered here this evening has controverted that ordinary view. It's moved us away from physical measurements, those grains of sand that limit us, those tick, 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 sweeping of the hands on the clock. It's moved us away from all of that. What we've considered tonight is pointing us toward spiritual freedom and the power that comes from identifying ourselves within the universe of God's creating, from connecting with the very mind of God. And so what this is telling us is that we actually do not live within a time frame. And what does a frame do? It boxes us in. It limits us. It restricts us. Accept the fact that you do not live within a time frame, and you start to have a whole different relationship with time. You have more dominion over it. You learn to use it better. You stop being the servant of time. You stop being pushed around by it. And instead, you rise above the whole picture of stress, discouragement, burnout, and fatigue, and all of their negative effects on your life. In 1903, 2 years before Einstein gave the world E = mc squared, Mary Baker Eddy wrote, "We own no past, no future. We possess only now. And the now that we possess is good and real and full of promise, because God, who is divine mind, is always present. Living in the nowness of eternity lets you challenge what the world says about pressure, time, and stress. living in the nowness of eternity, lets you see and accept yourself as an unrestricted spiritual idea, complete, vibrant, whole, not crossing the barriers of time, but coexisting here and now with God and the universe.